coalition leaders last night agreed to new changes to rent pressure zones, extending them across the country, but allowing new bills to set rents in line with inflation. The plan goes to Cabinet this morning, along with changes to local property tax, which will see homeowners pay a higher but modest increase from the revaluation of properties, which will happen from November the 1st.
I guess the softening of the blow last night came with the announcement that rent pressure zones, which currently cap rent increases at 2%, are being extended nationwide. They currently cover about 82% of rental tenancies.
This presumably was based on statistics that suggested that outside rent pressure zones, that rents were increasing at a higher rate than would be permitted within an RPZ.
That's what's happening. And yet every month almost, the Minister for Housing is being asked to, and in most cases consenting to, designating new areas as rent pressure zones, because there isn't anywhere in the country where there isn't a high demand for rental properties at the moment. I think the difficulty that they're going to come into with this, and they've tried to put some safeguards around it, and the other measures, is they're saying existing tenancies will remain at 2%, but new tenancies will be allowed to be reset at market rate. Now, what they're trying to do here to protect tenants is by saying that unless the tenancy is ended voluntarily, well, then the landlord cannot increase the rent to market rent. It'll only be able to stay at 2%. They think this is going to be, they're hoping this will be a protection of sorts, but I suppose there will be concerns that this will be difficult to implement. I guess if we look at why they're doing this, I suppose people will wonder that it is because there has been a complete retrenchment in institutional investment into the housing market, which has been attributed to the fall off in apartment completions and also plans in the pipeline for new apartment dwellings. This can be seen from officials in the Department of Finance and the Department of Housing in the various updates to the Minister. I saw in the front page of the Mail on Monday's paper that kind of outlined the dramatic concerns there, and highlighting how, well, at the moment, we're now set to miss our housing targets again this year. We're looking at again the low 30s, and even concerns in the future
But just
years.
looking at those institutional investors, I mean, they're investing for an ongoing income. And if it's a new build, they can set the rate where they like. In fact, when you talk to daft.ie, it looks like all you're looking at when you're looking at rents are the rents that are on the market. In other words, new builds and things like that. Existing rents, there could be landlords who are charging much less than those headline rents. So new builds can actually charge what they like to begin with and protect themselves in that way. Why would the investment stop?
Because after that point they would be capped at 2% a year. So if inflation overtakes that, for example, they wouldn't be able to keep up with it. But this all goes back really to a warning from within the Department of Finance, a report 2 years ago on the level of residential capital coming into the country. They estimated we need 20 billion a year to hit our housing targets, and that 4 to 5 of this would come from the state. The rest would have to come from private capital. The level of institutional investment has dropped off by 80% since the mid-2022, and that's what sent the alarm bells ringing in government. Now, look, there's a counterpoint to all this as well, which is that these institutional investment funds largely build to rent properties. So what'll be really difficult for the government to navigate now is how are they going to defend this? Because one, they're creating a better playing field for build to rent apartments, right? And at the same time, renters are going to have to pay more across the board. So it'll make it even harder for them to save up for a deposit to own a home if they want. So how then can they?
If you can find a home to buy, and this is one of the problems when you look at all the new blocks. All to rent.
So how are they going to claim to be parties of home ownership when this is the environment they're creating? So that's why I think the LDA aspect of leg of the stool being missing today is really damaging for them.
All right. We'll come back to you in a moment or two. But Rory Hearne, what is your reaction to this? I mean, it does look more like a tenant's charter than a landlord's charter.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that analysis, Pat. I think that when you look at, one of the key measures that have been implemented here is the ability to bring the rent up to market rent between tenancies. So when the current situation is when a tenant leaves the property, the new tenant coming in is still paying the rent that was there, supposed to be paying the rent. Now that's not going to be the case. And so what we're going to see is what Focus Ireland talked about yesterday, deeply worrying, is this incentivization of evictions of tenants in order to get the rents up to market rent. And this is what we were really, really concerned about. And unfortunately, this seems to be part of it. There's a mention that Large landlords will be have no fault evictions in place, but half of all tenancies are held by smaller landlords. So you have half of renters not covered by security of tenure. These measures will lead to huge stress and worry amongst renters. They will lead to more renters being made homeless. They will lead to rents rising across the board. And of course, we have to be clear here, the government can dress it up in whatever way they want, but behind it, they've made it clear the purpose of this policy is to incentivize investment in the private rental sector. And the way they're saying they're doing that is by allowing rents increase. So this policy will lead and is meant to lead to higher rents. And the question is, why are they introducing a policy that's making housing more unaffordable that will lead to higher rents when renters are already
the law of
struggling to cover these rents?
Is it the law of unintended consequences, Rory? Because again and again on this programme and on other programmes, you get landlords phoning in and saying, look, I have a tenant, great tenant, but we're well below market rents at this point. And, being allowed to increase by 2% does not cover the increase in expenses, insurance, et cetera, that I'm incurring. And yet I cannot increase to market rent even when the tenancy ends voluntarily. So this was an attempt to address that, but maybe there are unintended consequences, as you point out.
Well, look, the figures from the Residential Tenancies Board shows that rents have increased across the board, year after year. Even the average rent of existing tenancies have continued to increase, even beyond the 2% cap. And this is the fundamental problem here. The government have introduced a series of measures that are actually very confusing. I think it's going to be more chaotic in the private rental market. They were talking about introducing measures that would lead to certainty. I think this is going to lead to more uncertainty, particularly for renters. And the thing that had developed with the rent pressure zones, the 2% cap, it was clear what rights and renters had, what obligation landlords have. This is adding a huge layer of confusion into the system that will really disempower renters. And it doesn't address the fundamental problem. Because even, these measures now that they introduce allow, new builds, set rents, inflation. What happens when inflation hits 5%, 10%? There's no guarantee it will incentivize supply. And why are we making our policy for, as you've mentioned, as Craig mentioned, as you've mentioned, to incentivize the delivery of build-to-rent properties that are already too expensive? We don't need more build-to-rent properties. We need affordable homes that people can buy and rent, and that's what policy should be focused on.
So how do you do that? How do you force developers and builders to build for sale rather than for rent? What is the policy instrument that would achieve that?
Well, there are many policy instruments you can use that. Firstly, the big blocks to supply we've been hearing are things like investing in Uisce Éireann, investing in the infrastructure that enables builders to build. The other core thing is the state itself has huge potential capacity and huge capacity to deliver. Craig mentioned similarly the Land Development Agency. There's huge potential in the Land Development Agency to be delivering more if it had greater compulsory purchase order powers to buy land, develop land, do what they do in other countries in terms of the state, putting the infrastructure in there, enabling the delivery, then bringing builders on stream. As I've argued for before, we need public construction. That would add capacity into the system. But in particular, what we're seeing, like in my own constituency, the Minister for Housing has just cancelled a series of social housing projects and said that they're not going to fund them now. We've seen similarly with the not-for-profit housing bodies saying they're being delayed in terms of their funding. There are things the government is actually doing which is blocking public housing delivery. We need a focus back on what the state can do rather than incentivising a supply of unaffordable build-to-rent properties. And really this is a policy that is bending to the lobbying of landlords rather than looking at what renters need. It is really, really disappointing. I think it's a cruel decision that's making renters pay for the problems and crisis that this government has failed
Craig,
over and over in housing.
Craig?
Yeah, we talk about potential delivery options. I said this will be a big blow that the LDA measures aren't being brought to Cabinet today. The Cabinet Committee on Housing met last week and they were trashing through these proposals. It was the Department of Finance who had an issue with them. And just to tell your listeners what they are, it would have allowed the Land Development Agency to purchase private land, which is a massive departure, and also to build some private housing. Because at the moment we knew they were only supposed to be delivering public housing on public land. And this is despite the fact that their own reports say that they have enough land for 70,000 units. Now, there's an issue with site services and all that and getting things ready, but this would have been a major departure. And they were also seeking to exempt cost rental developments from corporation tax. Now, the people in the Department of Finance, I understand it, have big issues with this. So the fact that this isn't on the table today to be brought to the Cabinet, to be able to say, here's what we're also doing to stimulate supply, is a major issue.
Maybe they want two bites of the cherry, some what they imagine to be good news, although Rory has demurred this week, and then next week they do a the LDA.
There was supposed to be a series of announcements today, including I will say the announcement of the so-called HousingZAR, but they're struggling to fill that role. The latest name that was being discussed by the leaders was actually the head of the LDA, John Coleman, who, as I understand it, isn't interested in.
By the way, what is the issue with allowing the LDA to be involved in private housing, which would be sold and therefore generate more rollover funds for the LDA?
Sure, that would fund it in that mechanism, but the argument goes back to initially they were going to be allowed to that in the remit when they were established in 2018. That was changed then in 2020 because we had this big political row over should public land be used for private housing. But then there's also a question to ask.
Are they saying that the land would effectively be free?
Well, no. See,
because that would not be sit well with the taxpayer
and state aid rules as well. So perhaps it would have been only on the private land they purchased, because they're also looking at there's about 47,000 active planning permissions in Dublin alone, for example, that aren't being built on. Perhaps they could come in and move on some of those issues. But I think the fact that that's come down is going to be a really big issue for them. And when you look at the performance of the LDA so far, they haven't really excelled in delivering housing. They've done a lot of acquisitions. So I think also as well to be putting a lot of confidence in them to suddenly be able to tool up and deliver housing at a large scale is hopeful.
All right, you disappointed the LDA announcement didn't come today, Rory?
Yeah, I think it's, again, I think it's an example of this government being, as I said, chaotic in their approach. They have made a number of measures that just seem illogical. And one of them is this failure to move on immediately, as I've described it before, failure to take an emergency approach to dealing with things like the Land Development Agency, the extra powers it needs, the extra funding it needs. But similarly, as I said earlier there, in terms of things like infrastructure, Uisce Éireann have been making it clear to this government, for years that they needed additional funding to develop things like wastewater infrastructure. They've signalled very clearly that within 3 years, there will be no longer be able to be housing development in Dublin because they don't have the infrastructure in place. They've been warning about this for years and the government hasn't moved. So there are things that this government could be doing rather than doing things like pushing renters under the bus and making them pay for higher rents so that it might incentivize some supply down the line. There are things the government could be doing, similar the tenants in situ scheme, like a scheme that was actually working to prevent homelessness. The government has gone and cut it. And I met with the Dublin City Council last week, and they said that they can no longer implement that scheme. So we had a scheme that was keeping people in their homes. Now the councils have been told they don't have the funding from the department to actually deliver it. And as I mentioned earlier, similarly, social housing schemes have been stopped in Ballymun, areas that need social housing, the funding been pulled.